Bring back gatekeeping has recently been a popular headline in fashion publications and on social media, where journalists and content creators alike are criticizing the way that influencer culture, viral trends, and internet aesthetics are making us all dress, act, think, and even speak the same. The sentiment behind the idea that we need more gatekeepers has been around for a while. You might remember, for example, the 2021 viral New York Times article titled "We Should All Know Less About Each Other," which was actually an article about how social media amplifies political division. But on the internet, a screenshot of that title became a sort of reaction meme that people used when they felt like influencers and celebrities were oversharing on social media for attention or trying a little bit too hard to be relatable, often with the purpose to either sell us something or further build their personal brand. The slogan "Bring Back Gatekeeping" is a similar reaction to online oversharing and the internet obsession with authenticity, and it started to gain traction last year in the context of influencer culture and fashion trends. But it came back to the forefront of online discourse about a month ago when a quote by the writer Emily Sundberg, author of the newsletter Feed Me, went Substack viral. If there even is such a thing. A lot of people are talking about it on Substack, is what I'm saying. The quote is, "We need gatekeepers again. New, more diverse ones. Editors, experts. Taste isn't a democracy, nor should it be populist. It comes from experience and exposure. Just because you eat doesn't make you a restaurant critic." A lot to unpack here, especially in the context of books, which have been the subject of gatekeeping and elitism pretty much for as long as there have been books. So let's talk about it. Before we get into it, I have to tell you about today's sponsor, Odoo. Odoo is an all-in-one management software that offers over 45 easy-to-use applications designed to make the day-to-day running of your business simpler. One of the great things about Odoo is that all of the apps are interconnected, which means that they seamlessly communicate with each other, bringing together everything that you need to run your business, including invoicing, accounting, project management, inventory, website creation, and more. And all of the apps are incredibly intuitive to use. Let's say, for example, that you're using their website app to create a website for all of your reading recommendations and reviews. All you have to do is sign up, choose the type of website you want to create, its industry and goals, and then choose a color palette or upload a logo, add pages and features, and select a theme, and you instantly get a website structure. All that's left to do at this point is add your personal touches, which is super simple to do. If you want to change a piece of text, you just click on it and write. If you want to add a new section to your page, you just drag and drop blocks from the side menu. And for images, you can either choose to upload your own, or Odoo is linked with Unsplash, so you can just search the Unsplash library of royalty-free images. There are also a ton of fun blocks that you can play with, like this little rating icon, which is perfect for book reviews. And this is just scratching the surface of what the Odoo website app has to offer. You can add videos, links to your social media, put in forms and charts. The sky is the limit, as they say. And to top it all off, the first app on Odoo is free forever, so you get to create your website for free, including unlimited hosting and support, and you also get a free custom domain for 1 year. So if you want to try it out, check out the link in the description. Over the past few years, the term gatekeeping has significantly grown in popularity online, and in the way that words sometimes mean something else on social media, the meaning of gatekeeping has also been somewhat expanded. As writer Anne Friedman explains in an article published in The Cut in July 2023, gatekeeping used to refer to people with their hands on the levers of institutional power. Gatekeepers were the media execs and political leaders who decided which voices are heard, what issues deserve attention, and where the money flows. But more recently, on the internet and in the context of influencer culture, gatekeeping has come to refer to anyone holding back any information, even if that information is of dubious or micro-niche value. A quick scroll through TikTok or Instagram Reels is enough to prove this point, because if you look at the most common use of the word gatekeeping on social media right now, you will find that it's often just used in the context of video recommendations for lifestyle, beauty, and fashion products. Expressions like "we don't gatekeep here" or the more pointed "hot girls don't gatekeep" have basically become the intro to a new genre of recommendation video where the creator tells their audience about their go-to moisturizer or leather jacket or hairstyling tool. Which is not to say that this isn't valuable content, but as Friedman points out in her article, the information at stake here isn't really that important. These videos are not widening access to community resources that have traditionally been hoarded by the rich and powerful. They're just sharing advice about how to be pretty, which is nice, but not essential. On top of that, even though the sentence "we don't gatekeep here" evokes this wholesome feeling of sisterhood and sharing advice on how to look and hopefully feel your best, ultimately the content itself is just more of the same influencer content that we've grown used to. Buy this, don't buy that, use my discount code, that type of thing. "We don't gatekeep here" is ultimately just a different, more subtle form of marketing. One that wants us to believe that the intention behind the video is more sincere or even morally superior to your average recommendation video. In her article, Friedman makes a very interesting observation about how "we don't gatekeep here" type content took off around the same time as influencers started to no longer use the term influencer and instead describe themselves as creators. She writes, "Influencers post with the crass motivation of selling things to you, while creators share what they know about living life right, all while pretending they don't need to cash in. We don't gatekeep here" signals both that you are in the know and that you are a person of the people who wants to magnanimously share that knowledge. Telling everyone you're not gatekeeping is a quick and easy way to signal authenticity and transparency, two traits that are premium now. So the idea that we need to bring back gatekeeping started to gain traction in response to this new form of influencer marketing. It's basically some people's way of saying, no, actually, let's just go back to gatekeeping because all of this content is more of the same old stuff. At the same time, and sort of related to this, the past couple of years have seen a growing number of people trying to reclaim their own personal tastes and preferences and attention, not out of a vendetta against influencers, but as an attempt to free themselves from the algorithm. We've seen it in conversations about personal style that were going on last year, for example. And even in the book space, more and more people are making content about niche book recommendations or content about books with highly specific plot lines and themes. And I've even come across people who start book talk accounts dedicated to content about books that they never see on the platform and which don't make for content that is typically successful with the algorithm. On the topic of algorithms, I was surprised to see that in this new wave of gatekeeping discourse, there aren't that many people talking about the way that social media platforms and the algorithms that govern them themselves act as gatekeepers. In that they decide in their mysterious wisdom what type of content gets pushed and what doesn't, and that they are also constantly changing, so topics and creators that are popular today may not be popular tomorrow. There was some discussion about this last year when The New Yorker published an article about the rise of the online culture curator. What is an online culture curator, I hear you ask? Just a content creator, basically. And as a little side note, it is interesting to see that we are constantly coming up with new names to refer to people who don't just make content about going to the gym or what they had for dinner. I recently saw somebody use the term intellectual influencer to mean a content creator whose content is not about their life or their outfits or stuff like that, but rather they make knowledge-based content. A common example is people who make content about personal finance, for example, or therapists sharing mental health advice and stuff like that. Anyways, this is just an observation about the fact that in the context of social media, all of these people, regardless of what the subject of their content is, are just content creators. But there is so much content out there right now that we need to come up with terms to differentiate between valuable content and just like slop. Which brings me back to The New Yorker. The gist of this article is that in a digital landscape overrun by algorithms and AI, we need human guides to help us decide what's worth paying attention to. So the online culture curator is born out of a need for a person who just sits there and goes through the astronomical amounts of content being uploaded every day and separates the good from the bad for the rest of us. The article also refers to this person as somebody who stands between us and the algorithm, a sort of human filter who also slows down the rhythm with which the algorithm moves from one topic to the next to keep us engaged. Digital platforms are largely devoted to making users consume more faster. Curators slow down the unending scroll and provide their followers with a way of savoring culture rather than just inhaling it, developing a sense of appreciation. One of the examples provided in the article is the Substack newsletter Magasin, which is a fashion newsletter that recommends various lesser-known brands alongside fashion commentary that, according to the author, might even dissuade readers from making a new purchase. Because, as they put it, informative posts are an antidote to fast fashion. And this is essentially believed to be the main difference between this new type of content creator and traditional influencers. The archetypal influencer produces lifestyle porn of one form or another, playing up the aspirational glamour of their own home and meals or vacations. The new wave of curators is more outward-looking, borrowing from the influencer's playbook and piggybacking social media's intimate interaction with followers in order to address a body of culture beyond themselves. I don't know how I feel about the term online culture curator, personally. It feels a little bit flowery to me, but I much prefer it to the term gatekeeper because, to quote a recent Substack article that I read on the topic, you don't really want gatekeepers. I think sometimes people on the internet use certain terms for shock value, and I think that the current enthusiastic calls to bring back gatekeepers are just another example of this. First and foremost, because many of the people who I see making TikToks about how we need to start gatekeeping things again belong to demographics that things like art, literature, fashion have historically been gatekept from. So I'm not sure what they mean when they say bring back gatekeeping. Writer and editor Sean DeLone wrote an article in direct response to Sundberg's statement about the need for gatekeepers titled, "You Don't Really Want Gatekeepers." And his main argument in this article is that what we really want are curators, which he defines as consumers with better taste. He also defines a gatekeeper as somebody who decides what gets made, and a critic as somebody who gives the audience the necessary language to talk about what they already feel about the art that they are interacting with. I have a love-hate relationship with the concept of taste because while I agree that there are things that are objectively good and things that are objectively bad, I think that the vast majority of art sits somewhere in the middle between those two extremes. And I agree with Emily Sundberg's statement that taste is the result of exposure and experience. However, historically, the type of person who has had the time and opportunity to interact with art regularly enough to cultivate their taste has been wealthy, upper class, and not often interested in widening access to art to people who were not exactly like them. And so I don't think that we can have a complete conversation about taste and who has better taste without addressing socioeconomic disparities between different groups of people. What I really loved about Chandelon's article is that he brings the figure of the critic into the conversation. Because I really think that part of the reason why so many people feel like art is stagnant right now is that there aren't that many big name critics producing in-depth and nuanced art critique at the moment. Generally speaking, both artists and the public have had a love-hate relationship with the figure of the critic. We like to imagine him as a bespectacled, pretentious, turtleneck-wearing twat who delights in being unnecessarily pretentious and telling us that everything that we like is shit. I saw a post by somebody a few days ago that said something like, "Pitchfork is an irrelevant piece of garbage unless they give my favorite artist a high score, in which case they are the arbiters of good taste." I really regret not taking a screenshot because I think it's a great way to convey our general attitudes towards the once mythical figure of the critic. What I mean by that is that, one, with the rise of social media and the way that social media gives everybody, including myself, a voice, the critic has lost power. Nowadays, fans themselves can just produce their own think pieces about the art that they do or do not like. And two, we have a tendency to associate the concepts of criticism or critique with almost exclusively negative feedback, which by extension makes the critic into the ultimate hater, which is not always the case. Quite the opposite. Anyone who has had to read a lot of critical essays about the novels that they were studying at university, for example, will know that a lot of the people who produced those works were huge fans of the books that they were critiquing. And even when the critique lands on the harsher end of the spectrum, it can still be extremely useful, especially when it comes to good critique of bad art. And when I say good critique, I mean criticism that is sincere and thoughtful and nuanced and not like loud takedowns full with personal insults of the creator of the thing that's being criticized. To quote Sean DeLone's article, the way to convince consumers to have taste, to change what is popular, is not through calling them out, but through thoughtful criticism. Critics, not gatekeepers, give us the language and ideas to act on what we already know intuitively, what we already feel about the art from experiencing it. You will rarely ever sway a true believer, but there were plenty of fans who thought Taylor Swift's last album was too long. This was posted in August, so he means the Tortured Poets Department. A function of a good critic is, to some extent, to tell people what they already see, to share in it and unpack the particulars so that they have more nuanced ways of talking about it and telling others what they think. That is the essence of taste. So I really think that what people, or at least some people, mean when they say bring back gatekeeping in the context of art and culture is that we are all somewhat starved for interesting, thoughtful, and thought-provoking content. I saw a TikTok the other day of this woman who was scrolling through old Vogue articles when the magazine published what she calls actual criticism, as opposed to the current articles which tend to be primarily descriptive without expressing an opinion, as if the writer was just copy-pasting the press release. And I've definitely seen people saying similar things in the book community. I saw a Threads post by the writer and poet Kathy Park Hong recently that said it would be nice if the New York Times book review section actually had an opinion about the books that it was reviewing. It really does feel like somewhere along the way in the last decade, something shifted culturally that changed the way that we both create and consume criticism, which made it lose all of its bite. I don't know if it's a matter of toxic positivity or if people in artsy literary circles just don't want to criticize anybody because they don't want to ruin possible working relationships, or if it's just that magazine publishing really is as dead as Emily Sandberg suggests, or it could have something to do with stan culture and the way that because of social media now, fans have direct access to critics. So everybody knows that there are certain books and artists, authors that they can't really criticize without getting doxxed or dogpiled at the very least. And I think that in the context of criticism, this is an unnatural dynamic. The critic should never care about what the audience think. This kind of self-awareness bordering on self-consciousness that social media creates is not conducive to good art, and it's definitely not conducive to good criticism. This is actually a topic that comes up in the book community regularly. Somebody will say something like,
"This is not a book review. This was horrible. This was boring. 1 star. I'm sorry."
And people will either say that they don't want to be too critical in case the author sees their review, or, and this is not really spoken about as much, but it's a perceptible attitude, People don't want to be too blunt about their opinions, especially about popular books, because they don't want to alienate their audience. They know that people will either unfollow them or have a strong reaction, dogpile on them, share the video into oblivion, and they're just never going to hear the end of it. The TikTok that I just showed is actually kind of an example of this. The creator, Eden, who is a pretty popular TikToker, or at least she's famous at my house, she had initially made a video in which she talked about how it would be nice to see more depth when it comes to online book reviews, and people immediately attached the elitist label to her, telling her that it's not that deep, that she's being pretentious, and so on and so forth. And on the one hand, I'm a little bit torn because I know that a lot of people who make social media accounts to post about the books that they are reading and enjoying are doing it as a hobby. It's just something that they do for fun. And in that context, their opinions are just as valid as anybody else's. And they should be able to express those opinions without feeling like they're being graded on a paper. But at the same time, I understand Eden's desire for better articulated book reviews, and I don't think that wanting to talk about a book for more than 20 seconds at a time is elitist in any way. You could argue that maybe it's a little bit misguided to expect Edward Said levels of literary criticism from an app that people use primarily for fun, but I don't think it's pretentious, and that's not what she was saying in the first place. I would even go as far as saying that recently I have noticed people weaponizing a little bit the label pretentious against anybody who is trying to push for more nuanced and interesting content, even when the person, like I believe to be Eden's case, is being super sincere and not at all trying to put anybody down in order to elevate themselves. To me, it's interesting to see this dynamic play out in the book community, where usually when we talk about gatekeeping, we talk about people who say, for example, that audiobooks are not real books, or that reading genre fiction doesn't make you a real reader and stuff like that. But I feel like saying something is not that deep and trying to shut down conversations and exclude people from the community because you perceive them as being snobbish is also a sort of gatekeeping. Speaking of snobbery and pretentiousness, something that I've noticed more and more on socials at the moment is that people are leaning into this identity of being a snob or a pretentious person. There are people, for example, making posts about how they just want to be disgustingly well read, which is not at all a bad thing, quite the opposite. Personally, I would love it if everybody in the world had the time and capacity to focus enough to read a ton of books and complete some sort of humanities course of study and stuff like that. So I'm not criticizing this in the slightest, but it can become toxic when the only way to measure one's own well-read status is through comparison to other less well-read people. I've recently come across the term TikTok taste, which is used to negatively describe people's preferences for things like music, movies, and even books that are very popular on TikTok. I can see where the term comes from because it's true that there are a lot of books, movies, musicians that get super hyped up on the platform, and I think it's normal human behavior to get bored or fatigued by a work of art when it becomes overexposed. And I obviously also agree that it's important to read more than just what your algorithm feeds you. I have a whole video about it. What I don't agree with is the way that we often take TikTok popularity to mean low quality. Referring to something like The Bell Jar or The Secret History as TikTok taste doesn't really say anything about the books themselves. Those are great books. And so referring to them as TikTok books in a derogatory manner is a different kind of snobbery. It has nothing to do with the actual quality of the art that we're being snobs towards, but rather it's about the perceived coolness of it. It's not that those books are not good, they're just very common references. A similar thing played out on Twitter recently when somebody made a post that just said, literature I'd label as Reddit, with no further comment, just a list of books, including anything by Brandon Sanderson, Blood Meridian, Ozymandias, Dune, Flowers for Algernon, A Song of Ice and Fire, anything by Murakami, anything by Stephen King, and House of Leaves. The list annoyed a lot of people, many of whom felt like these were some of their favorite books, so labeling them as Reddit was like a personal offense. Even though it's not really clear what it means for something or someone to be Reddit. Reddit is not a homogenous place. There are communities on there that talk about all manner of things, from celebrity gossips to astrophysics. So what is Reddit? Man Carrying Thing made a video analyzing this, and he comes up with some of his own answers. But the interesting thing to me is that all of these books are good and also pretty widely regarded as literary. Maybe a little bit less so for Stephen King, but even him, like, he has some pretty good books. So being a fan of any of the items on this list still gives you some sort of cultural capital. The minute the original poster grouped all of these books together and labeled them Reddit, however, even though it didn't change a single comma inside the books, something did change about the way that the people who love these books feel about themselves. Before this post went viral, liking Blood Meridian was cool and niche and made the person who loved it feel like they had something that other people didn't. Until the post reduced it to this Reddit cliche. I wanted to include this little anecdote in this video about gatekeeping because overall, although I don't like the term gatekeeping, I am happy to see that people are looking to cultivate their personal tastes and that they are demanding for more depth and diversity in the content that gets fed to them on social media. But I think that terms like TikTok taste and Reddit literature really highlight the limits of good taste as a concept. Depending on whose hands the power lies in, anything can go from having the label of height of intellectualism to Twitter discourse fodder, and vice versa. Which is why I stand by the statement that what we really need are not gatekeepers, but critics. Not people to tell us what is good and what is bad, but people who can help us learn how to talk about the things that we like and don't like in terms that go beyond calling stuff TikTok taste and Reddit literature.